Thank you for being with us this evening. It's always good to have company when you're going through material like we'll be going through tonight. I'm going to open in prayer. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity to be used by you tonight. I pray that you guide our thoughts and our understanding of the circumstances and of all the different things that you went through on Good Friday, Holy Friday. All these things that I lift up in your Son's name, in Jesus' name, amen. So, about 14 and a half years ago, I worked third shift for an internet service provider, but all that really matters is I did technical support. And I had a job where I got out of work at about 7 in the morning. And that would be pretty much the end of my day. I would come home and eat my meal, and I'd start winding down to go to sleep. And so at that point, I'd been up for quite a while, and I'd had a pretty full day, and everything's good, and you go home to relax. But on this particular day, about 9 in the morning, major news was breaking, and a plane had just flown into one of the World Trade Center towers. And thus would begin not the beginning of my night, but basically the very much lengthening of my day, with every hour seeming to bring another activity that happened that was just beyond belief and beyond understanding. And you just sat glued to the TV wondering what could possibly happen next. And then even hours after everything was pretty much all done happening, you don't know whether you can go to bed or turn the TV off yet, because you're like, it can't be over, something else is going to happen. And of course that was 9/11, which many of you probably remember where you were. Similar to probably when John F. Kennedy was shot, or other, sadly, similar things that we see all the time in the world we live in, because of the fall that Pastor Jim mentioned in Genesis 3, that really did break humanity, broke the world. Because of that, we see things like that happen that just make it hard for us to understand what's going on and hard for us to react appropriately. And the reason I bring that up is because when we look at the events of Good Friday, we see a 24-hour period, more or less, a single day that is, for a single day, it's the most talked about or most spoken to event in all of the Bible. There are more verses in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John alone related to that than any other subject in the Bible by far, just for that single day and all the different things that happen on it. You start out on a high. The disciples, they're gathering together with Jesus. Earlier in the week, he's triumphantly entered the city. Everybody was rallying to him. Couldn't be any more popular. They're in Jerusalem, and they're on the highest high you can imagine. And we look and we see in Mark 14, not even prior to that, but they're celebrating the Lord's Supper with him. They're essentially celebrating Passover a day early with him, but instead we see the Lord's Supper presented. Jesus is instructing them, and he's giving them so many things that they don't quite understand yet, but they finally get it. And apologies. But they understand finally or fully that, yes, you are the God. You are God. Here we go. John 16. His disciples said to him, "See, now you are speaking plainly and using no figure of speech. Now we are sure that you know all things and have no need that anyone should question you. By this we believe that you came forth from God." Jesus answered them, "Do you now believe? Indeed, the hour is coming, yes, has now come, that you will be scattered, each to his own, and will leave me alone, and yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." Now, knowing the end of the story, we know there's a lot here that they did not understand at that moment. But prior to his comments that they would be scattered, that they did not fully grasp at that time, they recognized that he is from God, and he is their teacher. They're with him intimately. It speaks in Mark 14 and Matthew 26. And when they had sung a hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives. So not only did they get taught by him, they ate their supper with him, they worshiped with him, and then they went to the garden, the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane. And they're going along with him there because he often had gone there. To teach them, to probably be at peace. Gardens, in every circumstance I can ever think of, are a place of refuge and a place of peace and rest. And so he went there with them and he continued teaching them as they walked to the garden. At this point, remember, this is all happening within about a day period of time. And if we go back to Genesis again, we see how the Jews recognized how a day happened. So right now, with the sun going down, this would be the beginning of Saturday for the Jews. So on a Thursday night, after they had supped with Jesus, after they had worshipped with Jesus, and now they're going into the garden, the sun has gone down, and Friday has begun. Their Friday has begun. They've probably been up all day, and they're heading to the garden with Jesus. Jesus is continuing to teach them. We know from later on, we're going to see Jesus praying earnestly. He's prayed for the disciples, he's prayed for himself, and he's prayed for us believers in the future, those who were yet to believe at that time. He did that earlier with the disciples. Now in the garden, he is praying for what he knows is coming to be taken from him if possible, but if not, that he would accept it willingly and humbly. And he's praying because he knows what's coming. You think about something you anticipate that you have to do, whatever terrifies you, whether it's riding a roller coaster and the anxiety of before getting on that, or whether if it's public speaking, if that terrifies you, think of how you feel just before you do it, and then imagine that 1,000 times worse. And Jesus knows what he's about to endure, and he's praying very earnestly to the point of sweating blood. But he still takes that on willingly, because it really is the ultimate act of love for us, a selfless act. He put us before him, us who were enemies of his. The scripture that was read, the Pharisees that we're going to get to in a little while as well as we look through the day, they're actively calling for his crucifixion and for him to be punished because he's convicting them of their sin. He died for them as well, because we're equally as guilty of putting him on that cross. And he chose to do so because he loved us much more than we can even begin to imagine. And so he's agonizing in prayer. His disciples are falling asleep. Again, imagine this is the end of what we consider our day, but just the beginning of theirs. They probably still slept at night normally, but they're hanging out with Jesus. They're still on a high. It's a late night with their friends. But they're sitting there waiting for him, and they're getting tired, and they're nodding off. And finally Jesus comes to them, and he says, wake up. Now's the time. Now it's going to happen. And so then what we see is the arrest of Jesus. At night, a multitude is coming to him. And they're coming to arrest him with clubs and with the soldiers. It's not just the priests, but they needed backup. They had tried to arrest him or wanted to lay hands on him in the daytime earlier on in the Gospels, in the good news messages to us. And they never could. He was always able to get away because it wasn't his time yet. He wasn't submitting to them at that time. In the daylight, they had no power over him. But in the darkness, they come in the night, hiding their actions. The rest of the public sleeping, preparing their bodies physically for the Passover they would be celebrating on Friday during the day. And here they come with clubs in secret in darkness, with Judas leading the way to betray his master in a location that he had often would have spent time with him in. And he betrays them with a kiss, and his disciples kind of react in a couple different ways, and both really highlighting the fear and lack of control they had. Peter reacts by striking a person with a sword, cutting off an ear. Totally out of control, and opposite of everything Jesus had taught about loving your enemies and not acting out in anger. Jesus fixes that situation and rebukes Peter. And then what you see of all the rest of the disciples that are there with him is they scatter, they run. Some running so quickly without even thinking that they runs away naked with his robe left in the hands of the guy trying to prevent him from running away. And they scatter because of fear. They're afraid, and rightfully so. If a multitude came crashing in here to take away Pastor Jim, we would probably be pretty scared. I don't know if we would all gather around Jim and try to defend him if people came in with weapons loaded and we didn't have anything to defend ourselves and weren't expecting anything to happen.
These guys would.
Yeah, they would, right? Well, that's good. I don't hope we don't have to test them on it. But the thing is, they weren't expecting this. I wasn't expecting a plane to fly into a building. I was expecting to just watch news and get some happy-go-lucky news or not as bad as usual news and then go to sleep. They were expecting we'll hang out with Jesus as late as we can and then we'll have a good night's sleep and we'll celebrate Passover with him the next day. And they had no idea that all of a sudden he was going to get taken forcibly from them. And so they ran away. And only a couple of them really linger around as we continue through that day. But as of right now, we've only spent maybe about 4 or 5 hours of the day. We'll say roughly speaking, maybe they ate about 6, and then he continued teaching them, and they're in the garden maybe around midnight. And by 1 o'clock, Jesus is in the clutches of the high priest, and at this point, he starts to get roughly treated. And we see him going to more than one high priest. He goes before the Sanhedrin, which is essentially the high priest, a bunch of chief priests, and then also all the scribes. Those are the people that were literate and writing down all the things that the religious leaders were using to teach and manage the people and lead the people. All the higher ups in the church, if you want to think about it that way. Maybe the best parallel we would have nowadays would be like the Catholic Church in Rome, where you have all that leadership of the church. And that's essentially how it would have been in this situation. All that leadership was there not to inquire of Jesus, not to seek out truth. Here Jesus was to testify to the truth. They didn't want the truth. They wanted to silence the truth because the truth had been convicting them. They felt their power on earth being attacked directly, which he was, because he was attacking them with the truth because they had gotten so far in falsehood, calling good what is bad and calling bad what is good. And they mock him, they beat him up a little bit, treat him very poorly, especially for religious leaders who should be leading by example and leading by the example of God, whom they claim to be following. And so from 1-ish in the morning until near daybreak, they have Jesus captive and prisoner, basically. Toward the end of the night, they're debating, what do we do with him? We want to kill him, but our law doesn't allow that. Our religious law doesn't allow that. So they at least recognized that. They at least recognized that killing him would be wrong by their own law. So instead of holding to their law, they try to circumvent it, and they get somebody else to do the dirty work for them. They conspire to have the Romans kill him, because their law is not the same law as God's law. It'd be similar today if we were like, well, the Bible tells us not to kill or lie or steal, but these laws in my community say that we can get around that in a different way. It'd be like civil law that is different than the biblical law. And that's who they appeal to. And so they bring Jesus to Pilate, and as the day is beginning, so Pilate's day of being the governor and having the responsibility to maintain peace in Jerusalem. His day is beginning as judge, as commander of that area, And here come the priests to him. And we look at Luke, I'll look at Luke 23 as we go through this. And he says, Luke says, then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. So all the priests and the scribes, not the common people, this isn't the everyday people, all the ones that ushered him in mightily earlier in the week. This is again, those leaders and those people in darkness doing this thing to him. They come as a great group leading him to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King. Then Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? He answered him and said, it is as you say. So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no fault in this man. But they were more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. So Pilate, at this point, this is his first introduction to anything going on, doesn't see a big deal here. He's like, I don't want to deal with your religious squabble. I've got other bigger things to deal with. So he hears the word Galilee. And when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, Herod was the ruler of that area on the Jewish side of things, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Normally he would have a palace elsewhere. He happened to be there. And so now by 7 or 8 in the morning, it's been a couple hours of daylight. He's bounced now from the religious leaders throughout the night. He's been up all night being questioned and beaten by them, mocked. Not roughed up too badly yet. As we know, it's going to get much worse. But still, a long day. He's probably been up maybe even 24 hours at this point. And so now he's being marched off to Pilate, now off to Herod. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. So they had nothing in common. Now here they were both able to have friendship through not understanding Jesus and his mission. And Herod to the point of mocking him with the religious leaders. And so this whole time, this mob of religious leaders is just carrying Jesus along from place to place, trying to get him killed. It's just rallying from courthouse to courthouse until they can get somebody that will do what they want him to do. And when he came back to Pilate, then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, you have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I want to highlight there that Pilate has literally examined truth. We see elsewhere when John speaks of this, which we'll touch on in a second, that Jesus is testifying the truth. And Pilate has examined the truth, and he finds no fault in this man. He recognizes the truth as being valid and not sinful or bad, as the priests are trying to proclaim. I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. And they all cried out at once, saying, away with this man, release to us Barabbas. As we continue looking, as we go through the timeline, we'll look at John chapter 18. They answered and said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. So they're calling what we know, especially now, but even what all the public knew at that time, because Jesus had been healing and feeding and providing for people for 3 years. And they're calling that evil, as they often would do, to call good evil and evil good. Then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew?" And of course he was not. He was a Roman citizen, not Jewish by religion or by gender or genetics. "Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." What we might overlook easily there is that Jesus indeed is our king. King means that he has authority over everything. And here, he is authoritatively the king of a kingdom that's greater than Pilate is seeing and recognizing, and it's greater than the Jews who are trying to kill him see and recognize. It is a kingdom that we recognize. It's God's kingdom. And at the same time, though, this king submits himself to a justice from the people that is a corrupted justice. So Pilate has him, he's giving in to the Jews, essentially, not yet to crucify him. We see in Matthew 27 again, and in Mark 15, as I'll read from. Jesus is in the soldiers' hands. It says the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole garrison, so all the troops that are there to protect and keep the peace. They called together the whole garrison, and they clothed him with purple, and they twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck him on the head with a reed, and spat on him, and bowing the knee, they worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took the purple off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. So not only has he been mocked by the religious leaders, the ones that should have known better, the ones that were of God, by name at least, now he is being mocked by the world, those who have no connection with God any longer. Even they are mocking him. It's almost as if Satan has grabbed him in the night and is just able to do whatever he wants with Jesus, and is putting him through all kinds of humiliation. And now he's been not only mocked but beaten by professional soldiers that know how to do that even more brutally than the priests would have done. And we see now in Luke 23, no, that's a little later, sorry. But essentially what happens is Pilate gives in to them, to their cries to crucify him. He tries everything he can to get out of it, as was in the reading that Pastor Jim read earlier. He wanted to release a prisoner who, in the eyes of the culture, should have been much worse, but they still railed for Jesus to be crucified. Pilate even has him beaten, and just horribly, in the hopes that that would be enough to satisfy them, but they still call for his crucifixion. And that's what ends up happening. The soldiers, after they mocked and beat him, proceed to march him through the streets. At this point, it's late morning, approaching noontime. Only 12 hours earlier, he had been celebrating and worshiping with his disciples. Less than a day, by far. Without sleep for well over 24 hours, probably. And not able to carry his own crossbeam, someone else needing to do that for him. Seeing some of his disciples now, the people having woken up for the day, probably wondering what's going on, crowds gathering and seeing this very public event going on. Many questioning, many who had been supporters of him, followers of him, curious about him, wondering what was going on, but at the same time, I'm sure keeping their distance, not wanting to be associated with him at all, so that they would not get caught up in this either. The Romans were much to be feared, and the religious leaders certainly were meant to be feared. And certainly nobody was going to stand up and intercede out of fear for their own heads, their own pain. But I'm sure they were still watching from a distance. A couple of the disciples did stick around close enough. We see John there. Once Jesus is on the cross, he speaks to John and says to Mary and John, he connects them. John becomes her son. Mary becomes his mother. He's passing on the fact that he no longer can take care of his mother and his family. And he's calling on John to do so. Certainly not the way anyone would want to face their end. By noon, he is on the cross. He's not alone. There's a couple of criminals there with him. There are many people around him that are close. Those are all the ones who hated him. They're actively mocking him. I guess if you want to say on the plus side, Pilate is getting a last dig in on the Jews. He has King of the Jews nailed above him and written in more than one language so that everyone would know that this was the King of the Jews. The religious leaders did not like that. But they still got their way, and he was being executed. But even at that point, we can see some hope there. Luke 23, there were also 2 other criminals led with him to be put to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." He's speaking to all these people who are hating him. He is forgiving those who are spitting on him, who have mocked him, who have beaten him with their hands, who have beaten him with thorns and sticks, who have spat on him. He is asking for their forgiveness. He is showing us the greatest example of his love. We maybe don't view ourselves as evilly as these people were, but in the eyes of God, our disobedience to God's law and God's will and Jesus' commands equally put us in that same spot. And at the very least, for those of us who have Jesus as our Savior and know now as Christians where our hope lies, this moment brings a great sadness. Because we are scattered with those disciples at this point in time. We can't even begin to imagine the lack of hope at this point that they have. They had hope in a king of power and glory, a man representing God, whom they later would recognize fully as God. Their leader was victorious earlier this week, and now, in less than a day, they're hiding in the city, hiding out for their lives. They're sobbing. They're probably exhausted, trying to figure out what does this mean now. Their teacher, their instructor is gone. But Jesus forgives them for their fear. He forgives those who had crucified him for their anger. While he's on the cross forgiving people, at the foot of it, they divided his garments and cast lots, and the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God." What they don't realize is that he is saving others. And he doesn't need to save himself, he needs to give himself up. The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answering rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Even in a place where we're seeing our punishment played out, we're seeing the punishment of the world played out, there's still hope shared there in the knowledge that Jesus is innocent and does not deserve what he's getting. We deserve what we get. My son someday will, I'm sure, hope will deserve what he gets from me. But the things that happen to us, we do on a daily basis, that the aches and the pains, the afflictions, all the things that are a result of our sin and the sin in the world, how much more we deserve than that. Jesus felt that on the cross. And so, as the afternoon is waning, and we're reaching 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus is just physically spent. Emotionally, he's got to be just beyond drained, more tired than you can imagine. Not only from lack of sleep, but just at this point, he's on the cross and God is turning his back on him. He is forsaking him because Jesus is bearing at this point the weight of our sin, and God cannot cast his eyes on sin without punishing him. And he is punishing Jesus in this moment. And it was about the 6th hour, so about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, no, that would be about noon. There was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. So from noon until 3, it was dark. The other Gospels mention that the sun was darkened as well. We don't know how, maybe just dark clouds, but essentially, just as it rained as we came in tonight, even the world was, in essence, weeping in dark. For the light was definitely fading from the world. In the 9th hour, about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. He said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. So when the centurion, the soldier that saw what happened, when that happened, he glorified God, saying, "Certainly this man was a righteous man." A righteous man is one who keeps the commandments. We know Jesus kept them holy. The whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breasts and returned. Even they recognized that at that point, too late to turn back from, they recognized how wrong the situation was. But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, taking these things in. I can't imagine that day. 9/11 was a long enough day for me, just wondering what is going on. And we feel the ramifications, the results of that we feel in our culture now. But it's not over at that point. For the Jews are concerned with the fact that it is Passover that Friday. And they can't have Jesus and the criminals on the cross on Passover. That would make it an unclean day. It would basically taint their holy day. And so, Mark 15, now when evening had come, because it was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, coming and taking courage, went into Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Jesus' body had hung there lifeless for a short while when the Jews had commanded that the soldiers go and break the legs of the prisoners to make sure they would be dead in time for Passover. And they did that with the thieves that we saw earlier, ushering in their death because they wouldn't be able to bear, as Pastor referred to the Filipinos, trying to feel that closeness to God. Once the legs are broken, they cannot support themselves anymore, and their death would come quickly. When they come to Jesus, he is already dead, his bones not to be broken. They pierced his side just to make sure, check, he looked dead. They pierced his side, and blood and water flowed, indicating the separation of the blood and the water, indicating a death. And so that's where we see Joseph now with the strength to come forward as a follower of God. Overcoming his fear, he comes to Pilate and asks for the body so that he can bury it. And Pilate marveled that he was already dead. I don't know if we think about it, but the fact is Pilate had spoken to Jesus less than 8 hours earlier and had been questioning him and speaking to him. In less than 8 hours now, someone who he had spoken with, who he thought was innocent, was now dead. And so he is surprised by that, rightfully so. Pilate marveled that he was already dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Then he bought fine linen, took him down, and wrapped him in the linen, and he laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid. And at this point, the day is waning. Friday is nearly over. And the Jews are beginning to celebrate the Passover. Essentially, Jesus has become our Passover lamb, their Passover lamb. The lamb that the physical, real lamb that they would slaughter for their Passover meal would have been slaughtered at the same time that day that Jesus was hanging, dying on the cross. That lamb that wasn't just meant to be consumed, but was killed because it was bearing the sins of the family. The family would have that lamb in their household for the week. They would lay their hands on it, they would pass their sin on to it, and then they would slaughter it. And that was part of the Passover ritual, part of the Passover remembrance, part of the Passover meal. In this case, people had laid hands on Jesus all week. In celebration, really. But in these last 24 hours that we just looked at, they're laying their hands on him and sin is just being heaped on him. And he just takes it. Without complaint, without talking back, without trying to justify himself or his mission. He just takes it, and he takes it right to the cross. And he separates himself from God in that moment, bearing the ultimate hopelessness, the ultimate loss of love, the ultimate punishment for us. And he did so willingly, like the innocent lambs that are slaughtered on Passover. And then he's buried in the tomb. And it's only through the rest of the story that we thankfully are not just ultimately sorrowful right now. As we picture that long 24, 36-hour wakeful day of stress, emotional and physical, for the disciples and the followers of Jesus, we know what they later would know, and that they didn't lose their hope permanently. And we look forward to Easter this Sunday to regain that hope again, I'm sure. But we should be mindful of that tonight as well, that he did this for us so that we didn't have to, so that we don't have to take that punishment. There's going to always be struggles and pain and crazy things like this week in Brussels that are going to happen. But we can't fear those things. We need to rather fear what will happen to us if we don't obey God. We need to fear God, not in the sense of the way we usually think of fear, but out of reverence and understanding that he is king and he has the authority, and we should be crying out, inviting people to come and learn about what Jesus did for them so that they can have a hope that goes beyond any pain or sorrow or terrorist attacks or deaths that come too soon or just anything of the bad you can think of that you know that's in your life right now. We have that hope that there's more to it than that, and we celebrate in the fact that as long as we still have breath, we can proclaim Easter morning. And I look forward to proclaiming that with you this week and this Sunday as we celebrate that. As I close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for what you did. We thank you for this longest day, Lord. As we read about that day in the Bible, all the details that are there, and much that isn't, we still see your hand working through all of it. A day that is called Good Friday, which means really Holy Friday, not good in the sense of anything we would want to glorify that he went through, but what he did gives us the opportunity to call you good and great and holy. We thank you that you did that for us when we were enemies of you, and we thank you that you make us friends through that action. And I pray that you embolden us to share this news with others, to share hope and salvation with them, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
I want to thank Kevin for walking through the events of that Good Friday, and although there were many things that went on, there's one thing that we want to focus on as we close tonight, and that is on the cross. And our salvation, our freedom has been won at the cross. And the way we want to close tonight is we want to invite you up here to the Lord's table.